And now, here we go. All right, thanks for the patience. So, as Moroni mentioned, my name's Travis. I had a previous career as a lawyer. Then I decided to join the Foreign Service of the United States, our foreign ministry that we call the U.S. State Department. I was a career Foreign Service officer for almost 7 years. And during most of my career, I was stationed outside of the United States, where I worked as a visa officer. So I've interviewed tens of thousands of visa applicants from all over the world, seeking virtually every type of visa. Many of those were students, though, especially in the busy summer months that we find ourselves in now. I have managed a non-immigrant visa section. I've actually also managed a fraud investigation team, which is charged with looking into possible instances of visa fraud. I've even trained visa officers in how to do their job. And when I was a visa officer, I was often very frustrated. Yes, the job is exhausting, it's very difficult, but my frustration came more from seeing applicants that were facing denials, not necessarily because they did not qualify for the visas that they sought, but often it was because they just didn't understand how the interview process worked. And so that's what I want to shed some light on today. I want to give you an insight into what to expect at the interview to hopefully start planting a few seeds to help you consider how you might be a little bit more strategic and hopefully result in a successful outcome. Before I get to that, though, I want to cover some new developments and some new trends that we're seeing in student visa processing. And I'm going to touch on some timeline considerations I want you all to start thinking about as you work to schedule your interview and ultimately plan to travel to the United States. And of course, I will take as many questions as I can in the time that we have. So before we begin, yes, I am a licensed US immigration attorney. My practice focuses primarily on what we consider to be consular processing, which is the actual visa interview and application process. But the point of this session is really not for me to provide specific legal guidance. To do that, I would need to connect with you one-on-one. I would need to understand much more about your unique situation. And only then can I give you real, guidance tailored to your unique circumstances. However, I'm going to do my best to answer as many questions as I can. But if you do have specific questions about your unique situation, please reach out to an immigration attorney. Don't leave this process to chance. I'll send my email address around in a moment here if you want to reach out to me. So let's start with the student visa process. I think this is probably review for many on this call, but just to kind of recap the process, I like to think about the application process in 5 general steps. It really starts with your decision to study in the United States and your application to a school or maybe multiple schools in the country. Once you've been accepted to at least one school, you'll start receiving an I-20 form, or for a J applicant, a DS 2019 form. And from there, you'll pay a fee, which is generally referred to as the SEVIS fee or the I-901 fee, which your school can help walk you through. The next step, step 3 on this chart, is where your visa journey truly begins. And that begins with an online application form called the DS-160. It's the same form whether you're seeking an F visa, a J visa, or an M visa. I'm going to give you some specific tips about the DS-160, but this is the beginning of what I commonly refer to as an exercise in trust. Everything you put in that application form has to be true, has to be accurate, has to be honest. Because if your visa officer finds any discrepancies in what's in that form and maybe what's true or what you discuss in your visa interview, the best you can hope for, unfortunately, might just be a denial. We'll come back to that. The next step is the most crucial step of the whole process, and that is the visa interview. I'll talk about the visa interview in a moment and give you some tips to help you prepare. But then, of course, assuming that you are successful, and fingers crossed that you all are, the last step is to travel to the United States. So recently, there have been a lot of updates to kind of the way the DS-160 form is used and reviewed, and it's actually more crucial than it even was in the past. So let me talk about the DS-160 form for a moment here. First of all, I recommend, and I strongly recommend, that you complete this form yourself. I'm totally aware that it's common in many parts of the world to hire an agent to complete this form for you, but that's dangerous. Because remember, as I said, this is the first step in an exercise in your credibility. If anything in that form is not accurate, your visa officer may simply conclude that you're not credible. They can't trust anything that you say, and then you're likely to be denied. So you're the only one that is going to pay attention to every detail in that form. You're also the only one that knows every detail to answer in that form. So trust me when I say that, yes, the form is annoying. It can take a few hours, but you absolutely can and should do it on your own, because you're going to save yourself potentially a lot of complications in the process. Now, when you submit the form, please check your answers before you submit it, because once you submit the form, you can't go back and change anything. It's locked in place. And then also print your responses, or at least save a screenshot of your responses before you hit the submit button. Because after the form is submitted, you can't even look at the responses that you submitted. So with that in mind, a major recent update has been around social media. There is a question in the DS-160 that asks for any social media platform that you are currently using or that you have used in the last 5 years. Now, this is part of a mandatory social media review. And so let me be clear here. You have to put all of your social media platforms on this form. And there is a drop-down menu. So if you have used or are using any of these platforms, you must list them on your form. If you leave even one of them off, it is highly likely that you will be denied. Your interview may even be canceled before you even have a chance to appear. Now, specifically for Facebook, because multiple people may have the same name, the State Department even recommends that you put the specific URL, the website address for your Facebook account, where you list your Facebook account in the form. Now, I would also recommend, because it is now a requirement from the State Department, that you switch all of your accounts to public before your interview and leave them on public until you get your passport back with your visa. Then I think it's safe to switch them back to private if that's what you choose to do. Now, I've mentioned that this is crucial. If you have already submitted your DS-160 form and maybe you forgot to put one of your social media accounts on there, I would urge you to submit a new form with all of the accounts listed. Then you will need to reach out to the embassy or consulate where you scheduled your interview and ask them to update your interview schedule profile with the new application ID number from the new DS-160 form you submitted. Note that this is not guaranteed to happen. Sometimes they will refuse to, associate your interview with the new DS-160. So it really is important that you do your utmost to, submit the form correctly the first time. So the other major change here, I mentioned that there's now a mandatory social media review process. That's actually now resulted in a new step to this kind of application and interview process that I overviewed earlier. If your visa officer decides that they are inclined to approve your application, they first have to put your application on pause, what's generally referred to as administrative processing. And then they have to go and review your entire online persona. They have to look through all of your social media accounts. And then they're really supposed to look at anything else that's publicly available. So I would assume that they're Googling you. They're looking for any other information they can find about you online. And this is where it's pretty important. If they find an account, like a Facebook account, for example, that you did not note on your DS-160 form, this is where you're facing a likely refusal. So it's really important that you list everything. So what is the visa officer looking for in this exercise? Well, they're looking for a lot of details. First, they're looking for a couple of things that hopefully none of you have on your online profiles. Things like evidence that you're supporting a terrorist organization, evidence that you have or are planning to do something illegal, a picture of you snorting cocaine, something like that. Evidence that you harbor a hostile attitude towards the US government or US citizens, anti-Semitic harassment or hate speech. These are the things that are really, kind of under the microscope right now. Hopefully none of this applies to you. My general guidance to student applicants is to take a look at your online persona, look at your social media platforms, including posts that you may have been tagged in. And if there's something that you wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable, appearing on the front page of your national newspaper, that's probably something you need to worry about. But beyond that, and what may actually affect more people here, are the last two bullet points here. Visa officers, when they're looking at your kind of online persona, they're also paying specific attention to any potential previous visa violations. So maybe there's a photo of you in a previous job or a previous internship. If that could potentially lead a visa officer to conclude that you worked in the United States without authorization, that could result in a denial. If there's any inconsistencies, I mentioned everything that you put in the DS-160 needs to be true. It needs to be honest and accurate. If the visa officer finds any small discrepancy, even though it may seem trivial, that could similarly result in a refusal. And so one area that I would pay special attention to is your LinkedIn profile. LinkedIn is the website where you list essentially your resume. Where have you worked? What have you done? When have you worked there? And you're putting the same information in your DS-160 form. Where have you worked? When did you work there? What did you do? What was your job title? If that information doesn't match, then your visa officer may simply conclude that something is not right. Maybe you were lying about something. And so you're not only really, or I would say you're not only, you shouldn't only be interested in reviewing your social media accounts for, some of this more scary stuff like terrorist organization support. You should also be reviewing everything with an eye towards, is this 100% accurate? Because that really is important now. Now, the other thing I want to mention here is the new expected timeline for this whole process. Now, in previous times, the application process would generally take maybe 2 to 3 weeks. From the day that you appear for your interview, it generally could take, well, maybe I'll say 1 to 3 weeks for some automated checks to conclude, for your visa to be physically printed, put inside your passport, and then for the passport to be returned to you. What we're seeing now with this mandatory social media review is an additional delay of around an average of 1 to 2 weeks on this process. And that's assuming that everything else in your application goes smoothly and you're not subjected to any other administrative process checks or delays. And so this is kind of a crucial calculation that I want you to start thinking about, given that we're approaching the middle of July at this point. So there is a new policy, which is a couple of years old now, where a visa officer is not supposed to approve your application if they're not confident that you can arrive in the United States by the first day of class. So what I want you to do is first look at the first day of class, the start date of your class as listed on your I-20 form, or the beginning of your program as listed on your DS 2019 form, and then work backwards from there. Given that there's now a new associated delay with the social media review on top of the kind of general processing time that you should already expect, I would really, really urge you to schedule your interview with at least about a month of time before you need to be physically in the United States. If you schedule your interview with less lead time than that, you're now starting to come up very close to kind of the drop dead date where your officer may conclude that you can't travel to the United States in time. And even if they wanted to approve you, they still can't. So this, I know, leaves a lot of you in a very difficult situation, especially because there are many countries where you simply cannot schedule a student visa interview right now. And so, what options do you have? Well, first, the preferred option is always going to be to schedule an interview as soon as you can in your home country, as close to your house, as close to your home as possible. This will avoid additional scrutiny. And assuming you can do this, again, with enough of a buffer before you need to be in the United States, that is definitely your safest option. But if you're unable to do so, you may consider requesting an earlier interview slot, what is sometimes called an expedited appointment or an emergency appointment. You do this by first paying the interview fee, scheduling your interview, even if it's out in 2026, and then going to the same website where you schedule the interview to request an earlier appointment slot. There are specific instructions on that website that guide you through how to make that request. Now, the downside to this is that this request may not be granted. First, if you've been refused before, the embassy or consulate's generally not going to approve an earlier interview time. Now, beyond that, given that it is taking longer for visa officers to review your social media for every single student that they interview, there similarly just may not be enough openings for the embassy or consulate to provide you an earlier interview date. So if that is not successful, then I might consider, if I was in your shoes, I might consider scheduling an interview somewhere else. Now, this of course may not even be possible because it may be expensive, it may be difficult, you may have to get a visa to travel to another country just to schedule an interview for a US visa. I'm aware that this is not the best option. But on top of all that, applying in a third country, not your own country, not the United States, we generally call that a third country application, that can also raise additional scrutiny during the interview. It can raise additional confusion. When I was a visa officer in Mexico, as an example, I was highly accustomed to interacting with Mexican visa applicants. I was very familiar with Mexican bank statements and other official documents. And so if somebody came to my interview window from, let's say, China or Australia or Pakistan, my first question was, why is this person here? But then whatever they told me and whatever documents maybe they had to corroborate what they told me were essentially foreign to me. And I also had a little bit more difficulty evaluating their ties to home, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. So their path to a successful outcome was just more difficult, unfortunately. But if this is the only option you have to get an interview in time, I think that you should probably take it. Now, the last option, and this is really kind of the worst case scenario, you're unable to schedule an interview anywhere in time. You're similarly unable to get an expedited or emergency appointment. I'm afraid that in that case, your only option is to work with your university or your school to try to defer the start of your class or your program. I know that many schools are considering how flexible they can be. Several schools are offering, various options, maybe a first semester of online courses while you kind of sort out the interview situation. So this is really a call for all of you to stay very close with your school administration, the DSO, the international student team at your school, and start asking them what might be an option if you find yourself in this situation. Don't wait until the last minute, because the longer you wait to start looking at your choices, the less likely it will be that you're able to find something that works for you. So I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the interview itself before I open this up to Q&A. In the past couple of years, we have unfortunately seen the refusal rate for F visas increase. And we expect that to continue increasing with these additional delays and vetting requirements that I've been talking about. Now, for a J visa application, the refusal rate has stayed fairly constant. It is less than one in every 4 applicants that are facing a refusal, so it's a little bit better. But this really does underscore what I was talking about earlier, which is the interview itself is crucial. And it's really important that you know what to expect and you know how to prepare so that hopefully nobody on this call finds themselves in that kind of negative bucket of people who are refused. And so let me start by shedding some light on what you should expect at the visa interview itself. First of all, visa officers are not law enforcement personnel. They don't wear uniforms, they don't wear bulletproof vests, they don't carry weapons. In some countries, that is the norm. A visa officer is essentially an immigration law enforcement official. So first of all, you should expect an officer who's an average person. They look like me. They may be Asian, they may be white, they may be Black, they may be Latino. They just look like an average American. They're probably wearing a suit and they just look like a government bureaucrat. But beyond that, you should expect that your interview is going to be very fast. I used to interview well over 100 people a day, sometimes over 150 people in a single day. And that means that I had maybe 1 to 2, maybe 3 minutes on average that I could spend per interview. So don't be alarmed if your officer maybe doesn't look at you very much. I often had my face buried in a computer monitor to the side while I was reviewing DS-160 responses and other data. But it also means that your officer may interrupt you during the interview. I want you to expect to be interrupted because if it catches you off guard, it can kind of trip you up, make you nervous, and then it can kind of ruin your flow and your chance of success. Beyond that, plan to speak English. And let me be clear here. There's no expectation that you speak flawless, unaccented, complex English. The expectation is simply that you have a fundamental knowledge of the language so that you understand what's being taught in your class in the United States. So plan to speak English, but don't challenge yourself to speak with long sentences or complex words. That's not a requirement. And then finally, the whole reason that the United States requires you to come in person to a visa interview is so that a government official, in this case, a visa officer, can talk to you and evaluate your qualifications based on the dialogue, the communication. Visa officers are trained not to rely on documents because a document can be forged pretty easily. And so many people leave a visa interview after being denied and they say, I prepared all of these documents and the officer wouldn't look at any of them. Let me tell you, that's the norm. I will recommend that you bring some documents to support what you say, like bank statements, for example, to support the money that you have to pay for your expenses. But don't rely on those documents to demonstrate your qualifications. So what are the qualification requirements? This is really important for you to keep in mind as you prepare for your interview. And it's actually fairly simple. Your visa officer is going to be thinking about 3 general ideas when they evaluate whether or not they can approve your application. Number 1, do you appear to be somebody that is planning to use this student visa to travel to the United States, enroll in class, graduate, and then use that degree for some clear reason? If you're a J applicant, do you appear to be somebody who's credibly going to the United States to do whatever program it is your DS 2019 form mentions? Or are you seeking this visa to come to the United States, not to be a student or scholar, but instead to maybe find a job or do something that you're not allowed to do under this visa? Number 2, do you have sufficient financial arrangements? This is for F applicants. Do you have sufficient financial arrangements to essentially cover the expense of your education and your associated living expenses? If you're bringing family with you on an F2 visa or a J2 visa, The similar question will be, is there enough money for your family members as well? And remember, family on an F2 visa cannot work while they're in the United States. So you need to show that there's enough money to cover all of you while you're in the country. And you won't be able to rely on a spouse or a child's work to help finance your expenses. Then number three, do you have what we commonly call ties to home? And this is often the most difficult concept for students to convey. What the requirement is that you plan to leave the United States after you graduate or after your program comes to an end. You don't have to show that you own property or you've got a career waiting for you, but you do have to establish that your plan, your life path, is going to take you out of the United States when your studies or your program come to an end. And the other thing that I want you to keep in mind here is the law is written against you. And what I mean by that is the law requires your visa officer to assume that you do not qualify for a visa unless and until you can establish that you do qualify. And so what that means in practice is that it's your responsibility as an applicant to demonstrate why you deserve the visa. It's not the visa officer's job to make your case for you. And this, I think, is the single biggest issue or concept that student applicants kind of don't understand before they go into the interview. And I think it leads to a lot of denials. Your job is not simply to answer the officer's questions with a one-word yes or no. Your job is instead to volunteer why you deserve the visa. So what I want you to do when you prepare for your interview is challenge yourself to introduce your situation. First of all, be ready to confidently tell the officer where you're going to school, what you're going to study. Then think about explaining why you personally decided to study in the United States, why you chose the specific school that you're going to attend. What is it about this major or this program that interests you? How will this degree or this research program help you in your future career or your future life? What specifically do you plan to do with this degree? And again, it needs to be outside of the United States because that's how you establish that you have ties to home, that you're going to leave the country. And then finally, how specifically do you plan to fund your education and living expenses? And when you talk about your financial arrangements, I want you to be as detailed as possible, provide as much context as possible. If you have sponsors that are helping pay for your school, explain where their money comes from and why they've decided to fund your education. So I want to leave as much time as I can open for question and answer, but very quickly before I do, as you are preparing for the interview, I do recommend that you review our online social media content. I would start with our YouTube channel, where we offer lots of free insights and expert advice. We have videos that talk about how to explain your funding, your choice of school, what to do if you've been denied before. So YouTube is a great place to start as you're getting ready for lots of free advice. If you are interested in going a little bit further and being as prepared as you can for a successful outcome, then I would recommend that you go to zfvisaguides.com. My partner Mandy and I decided to create a comprehensive suite of online courses, essentially self-paced guidance, where we've taken all of our experience as visa officers and as U.S. immigration attorneys to offer a course that specifically guides you through the DS-160. We have a step-by-step video guide about how to answer every single question in the form with as much detail and honesty as you possibly can. We even talk specifically about social media review, and we give some tips about how to avoid complications. We also have a guide that focuses specifically on preparing for the interview. What is the best way to effectively communicate your situation at home and your plans in the United States to, like I mentioned, demonstrate your qualifications for the visa? Then we have a complete course. It covers everything from the I-20 form to the DS-160, preparing for the interview, and even how to avoid complications or handle those complications that maybe aren't avoidable, like previous refusals, family members in the United States, complicated financial arrangements. All of that is covered in the course. And it also includes access to a bi-weekly live Q&A session with either myself or my partner, Mandy, to answer as many of your remaining questions as we can. And then if you have specific legal questions, I mentioned, don't leave this process to chance. If you have any criminal history, if you've been refused multiple times, if you find that you're stuck in an administrative processing delay, or maybe you just want help with a practice interview, send us an email at info@zfvisa.com, and we'll explain how we might be able to help. So with that, I want to open this up to question and answer. I'm going to go through the chat window here and answer as many questions as I possibly can. Let me ask that you put your questions in here only once. Please don't ask the same question multiple times. It just makes it harder for me to address everything. And I'm going to try to go through as many of these as I possibly can. So first of all, yes, this session is being recorded. As Moroni mentioned, a link will be available to everybody who registered for this webinar when we conclude. So I'm going to go down to Jenny, who has a quick question. Is having your visa canceled without prejudice the same as a visa denial? Kind of. So first of all, in the DS-160 form, there is a question that asks if you have ever had a visa denied or canceled. So you should say yes, and then a box will appear that says explain. So if your visa has been canceled without prejudice, I would simply mention that in your DS-160. Now, this is a place where you may also want to reach out to an immigration lawyer and evaluate maybe why your visa was canceled. Sometimes a visa is canceled without prejudice when you apply for a new visa, just to avoid complication and confusion. The old visa is canceled. But there could be something a little bit more serious going on, like this could be the result of of perceived fraud in your situation. So before you proceed, you may want to reach out to somebody to evaluate what led to the cancellation, and then make sure that it's not something you need to be concerned about. So the next question here is, if somebody's applying for an expedited interview for a resumption date in August, what else can I do? I've got a visa interview date for October 30th. It's a good day, that's my birthday. But my resumption date is August 23rd. So this is really what I was referring to earlier. This is where I think a lot of students are finding themselves today. If your interview date is somewhere out in the future, such that you can't make it back for the start of your class or the resumption of your class, your only option is either request an emergency interview appointment or consider maybe applying somewhere else. And applying somewhere else, I mentioned, is risky. It could result in additional scrutiny, maybe additional confusion. But if that's your only option to get that interview scheduled, to get that visa and come back to the US, I would strongly consider that. So Evelina asks, what does it mean public? Is it okay if my account is public, but some photos are available to be seen by my friends? So Evelina is referring to social media. The new requirement that was announced a couple weeks ago is not only that you list all of your social media accounts on your DS-160, but also that you change all of them to public. And that's simply so that your visa officer has access to your accounts to review all of the content. So Evelina, I would suggest that not only your accounts are public, but all of the information in your account is public. Because my understanding is that if an officer finds anything that they cannot access, that could be taken as a sign that you are trying to hide something. And that alone could result in a denial. So I know this may be a little bit scary. I don't like the idea of public social media accounts for many privacy related reasons, but that is the requirement. And so that's what I would suggest. Let's see. For social media, someone didn't know that we needed to include Reddit and Pinterest, but only included Facebook and Instagram. What would be the impact? This is a big problem. I would strongly recommend that anybody who didn't list all of their social media accounts on their DS-160 submit a new DS-160 form with all of their accounts listed. And then again, make sure that your embassy or consulate updates your interview schedule with the new application ID number from the new DS-160 form. I understand that this may not have been an intentional omission. I'm sure in most instances it was a complete accident. But unfortunately, your visa officer may look at that as intentional, no matter what you say, and that could and possibly likely will even result in a refusal. So the safest option is to submit a new form and list everything there. So Manoj is a minor under 18 years, and he's wondering if he needs to submit social media accounts, but he doesn't have any social media accounts. This is another good question that we're getting a lot in the past couple of weeks and days. So what I generally recommend for this entire DS-160 process, and specifically with social media review, is that you are simply honest and transparent. I have not recommended to any client that they delete anything from any of their accounts. I certainly haven't recommended that anybody create a social media account just to help their chance of success. Instead, what I want you to do is just transparently mention your social media accounts. If you don't have any, don't mention any. And then during your interview, be prepared to confidently say, I have no social media accounts. You may even want to explain why. Maybe you don't believe in social media. Maybe you have your personal reasons. I haven't had a Facebook account for over a decade because I don't like Facebook. I just don't like the idea of making all of my personal life public. And I would explain that during my interview. Just because you don't have any social media accounts doesn't mean you're going to be denied, as long as you are honest and your visa officer understands that you're being honest. So Michelle has a question about funding. On the I-20, they only have family funds and no personal funds. During the interview, can they present to the officer that they have some money saved up to support their studies in the US? Yes, absolutely. The I-20 form is not always going to be granular detail about every source of funding that you have. Family funds is quite often kind of a general catch-all reference to maybe funds from parents or your personal funds that might be kind of grouped together to pay for your expense. What I would recommend is when you are talking about your funding, consider all of your sources of funds, whether it's from a loan, a scholarship, sponsors, and explain all of that. A common question that I get is, what should I tell the visa officer when they ask how I can pay for my school? And my answer is always, well, what is your plan? What is your honest arrangement that you have in place? Whatever that is, that's what you should explain. So yeah, I wouldn't worry as much about the line items that are listed on your I-24 form, as long as the sum totals are accurate. I would focus more on how you explain your financial arrangements at your interview. Sophus asks if they need to report a social media account if it hasn't been used for over 5 years. I would say yes. If the account is still active, if you didn't deactivate it and delete it more than 5 years ago, then I would say yes, you should reference it, because there's still a chance that your visa officer might find it. I've had people ask, hey, I have a YouTube account. I've never watched a video with it. I've never posted a video with it. Do I need to list that? Yeah, you've got to list everything. It's that important. And I would not leave anything out, because that could just simply result in a denial. So Cynthia says, at the time I filed my DS-160, I had not traveled internationally, but I recently did. What should I do? Well, I would say at your visa interview, be prepared to mention that. First of all, I'll use my passport as a prop here. The first thing I would generally do when I was starting an interview is I would pull up the applicant's DS-160 responses. I would start scrolling through them, and I would pick up their passport and flip through it pretty quickly. And what I was looking for is, okay, is this somebody who has traveled internationally before? Do they have any visas that they had to apply for from another country, and show their qualifications there? Have they left their country and come back to their country, which is, a good sign that maybe they'll come back from the United States after their education concludes. So even though you may have a recent trip that wasn't listed in your DS-160, you should have proof of it in your passport. And so your officer should see it, but you should also be prepared to mention it during your interview. Okay, so Jassim says, if there's already another student visa stamped in the passport, what then? Assuming that you already have a US student visa, then you should explain maybe why your plans have changed, what prompted you to apply for another visa. If you have a student visa from a different country, I think it's kind of similar. Explain what maybe changed. Maybe you were originally planning to study in Canada, but now you're planning to study in the United States. I think the answer to a lot of these questions is just, what is your honest situation? That's what you should explain. Let me see. Wenjia asks about an upcoming exchange program. What visa do you need? That would be specific legal advice. Reach out to me. I need to know more about your plans, and I can give you an answer. Okay, what if the officer speaks in my local language? This is something Dennis asks. They might. Officers are trained in the local language, usually, where they are going to be assigned. So I learned Mandarin Chinese before I was assigned to Beijing, China. I was able to improve my Spanish before I went to Mexico. This is pretty normal. So I would often, talk to an applicant in their native language, because that was just kind of the norm of my day. However, as I mentioned earlier, student applicants should speak English because they need to convey to the officer that they have at least a basic understanding of the language. An officer may just kind of be on autopilot. They've talked to the last 12 applicants in Spanish, for example, and they just didn't realize that you're seeking a student visa, and it didn't occur to them that they should switch back to English. So you should kind of proactively, even if they talk to you in your local language, you should respond in English and conduct the rest of the interview in English to show the officer that you speak enough of the language to, understand what's being taught in a US classroom. So the next question here is, in my country, Nigeria, just got an update to the visa validity for non-immigrant visas. Now it's single entry for 3 months. Yeah, this is basically a day and a half old, very recent announcement. And by the way, it doesn't only affect Nigeria. I understand it may also affect Ghana and potentially other countries as well. I'm going to put a link in the chat window here to a website that the State Department maintains, where they go through what we call reciprocity. And reciprocity means a lot of things. It can refer to the fees that you have to pay, but it also will tell you the validity of a student visa if you are from a certain country. So yes, you're correct that for Nigeria, the validity has been limited to 3 months, and you only can enter the United States one time on that visa. It does complicate your life, because that means that, normally you can apply for a student visa up to 1 year before your class begins. Well, if you're from Nigeria or Ghana, and potentially other countries as well, you don't have that amount of flexibility. So it takes even more, or it puts more emphasis on the need to plan ahead, schedule your interview where your visa will be issued within 3 months of the date you need to be in the United States. And then remember that if you're only issued a single entry visa, if you leave the United States, whether it's for a holiday or to visit family or whatever the reason is, you're going to have to apply for a new visa before you can return. And given that there are associated delays with the process, it's difficult to schedule a student visa now, you should probably start planning proactively before you leave the country to make sure that you'll be able to both schedule an interview and then that you have enough of kind of a buffer of time to let the process conclude before you come back to the United States. So I'm going to scroll down here. Sophus asks a really good question. What if I plan to find a job in the US after graduation? Well, okay, look, I understand that many international students have an ultimate goal of eventually working in the United States. And if that is your plan, I applaud you. I would love it if you use your US education in the United States. However, the legal requirements for a student visa are that you're going to leave the country after you graduate and after any work experience like OPT or STEM OPT concludes. Now, this is how I would think about this. If you want to stay in the United States and work in the country, you will need, generally speaking, an H-1B work visa, though there may be some other options as well. The H-1B, for most types of positions, is generally referred to as a lottery because there are actual caps on the number of these visas that can be issued to people from certain countries. Even if you're not subject to a maximum cap, you still might not be approved for a work visa. So what I want you to do is consider that you're simply unable to work in the United States. That door has shut for whatever reason. You can't get a visa, you can't find a job, whatever the situation is. If that is your situation, what would you do outside of the country? And that's what I want you to focus on at your interview. Now, to be clear here, I don't want you to lie. I don't want you to say, I'm definitely going back to my home country where I'm going to work at the Travis company. If that's not your plan, then don't say that. What you might say, though, is something like, after I complete this master's degree in marketing, I've been looking at this company in my home country. It's the Travis company. They sell really cool race cars. I would love to get a job at that company, and I think that this degree will help me be competitive. So you're not saying that that is your plan, but at least you're providing a very detailed, concrete example of what you might do outside of the United States with this degree. So Wai Ling says, I won't be able to see the available appointment times until I've submitted the DS-160. Yes, generally speaking. So the way the process works is before you can schedule an interview, you have to submit the DS-160 form. Then you have to pay for the interview for a specific country, a consulate or an embassy, and then you can see the available dates. So one thing to clarify here, and this is actually very confusing. When you submit the DS-160 form, the first step of the process asks you where you're planning to schedule your interview. It's a drop-down menu of every US embassy and consulate. Even if you select, let's say, Beijing, China, you can still schedule your interview anywhere in the world. That drop-down menu essentially has no effect. I'm not even sure why it's still on the form at all. So just to be very clear, you are not locked into the specific location you choose when you start the form. You can still schedule an interview somewhere else. The problem is you have to pay the interview fee for a specific consulate or embassy before you can see the available times there. And you may find that there's nothing available until 2026. And if you're not successful in requesting an earlier appointment, then you may have to pay a fee somewhere else to see availability there. It's an imperfect system, and I'm sorry that you have to go through those steps. So Jassim asks, will parents get a tourist visa quickly? Do they have to wait until the student visa has been issued? Not necessarily. So this is a very nuanced question. I would need to connect with you and understand your parents' plans, their situation. I can't really give specific advice, without knowing more. But generally speaking, parents should be able to qualify for a tourist visa, you know, even if the child has not yet gotten a student visa. Uh, it may be a little bit more difficult in some situations, which is why I would need to talk to you. If their only purpose of travel is to go and visit, their child who's studying in the U.S., it's probably safer to wait until the child obtains their visa before the parents apply. But this is where I would say reach out to us and we can give you specific guidance for your specific situation. Let's see. Sarov asks a really good question. Well, are they just going to reject us if we start volunteering all these details? It seems weird, and it actually is a very unnatural way of communicating. If I was to say, Moroni, what did you have for breakfast this morning? And his response was, well, I got up a little early and I walked outside of my house and I smelled this really good smell. So I went down here and I decided that before I eat breakfast, I might go for a run. So I went for a run and then I did this. That's a very strange way of communicating because he's telling me a lot of details that I didn't ask him for. But that is actually what you need to think about doing in the visa interview. Because remember, you have to make your case for the visa officer. You have to volunteer why you should be approved. Let's say, for example, you have a full scholarship for your program, but the officer doesn't ask you if you have a scholarship. If you don't volunteer that detail during your interview, the officer will not know. And that's actually a very positive detail that can help you succeed. And there's a lot of other positive details that are similar to that as well. So you really should be prepared to proactively tell the officer why you should be approved. Stephen is from Ghana and he's still unable to find an interview. I'm really sorry. I will say you're not alone. Many countries opened new interview appointments and they were immediately snatched up, and now there's nothing else available. I understand most of the consulates and the embassy in India either never reopened student visa appointments or they may have for a short window and they were immediately taken. This is something that's affecting international students from virtually every country at this point. So, Stephen, my advice to you is what we talked about earlier. Consider requesting an expedited or emergency appointment, and you may also think about applying somewhere else. And if neither one of those options are successful, unfortunately, you may need to explore deferring the start of your program. Jassim says it takes about 3 to 4 weeks to get a visa after an interview. What if our parents wish to accompany us to the university when we travel for the first time? How long will their visa take on average? It very much depends. I would expect generally that the process would be faster for parents because there's not this associated mandatory social media review, but it could take just as long. And so you may consider applying together with your parents, but that could actually raise additional complications. So I would still generally say you should probably apply first for the student visa, and then your parents should apply. If you're worried that they're not going to have time if they wait to apply, then yeah, maybe they apply sooner. But reach out to us and we can give you advice for your specific situation. Akmal, this is a good question. What are the most common tricky questions one might get at the interview? So unfortunately, I can't tell you specifically what questions you will be asked. Visa officers rarely ask the same questions twice, because if they did, there would simply be a script available online and people would just study and memorize a response. And that kind of obviates the whole purpose of the interview. But there are a couple of common questions that you might expect. One of them would be, why did you choose this school? And this is actually more difficult than you might assume. Many international students will explain their choice by seemingly just reciting a Google search result. Something like, I chose Travis University because it's highly ranked, it offers flexible curriculum, it will help me improve my skills in computer science so that I can find a good job. That honestly really might be at least part of how you reached your decision. But it doesn't tell the visa officer a single personal detail about your motivation, your thought process. And remember, one of the criteria that your visa officer is thinking about is, do you really appear to be somebody who's going to the United States to study? And a way that you can help to establish that case is show the officer that you've done a lot of due diligence. You've put a lot into this decision. If you think about it, if you're going to a foreign country where you're going to spend a year, 2 years, 5 years of your life, and quite frankly, a lot of money, I'm guessing that you've thought about this for a long time. There's probably something very personal in your life that helped you arrive at the decision first to go to the United States, then to go to a specific school in the United States. And so challenge yourself to dig deep and then explain your real authentic thought process that led you to this conclusion. That's what the officer wants to hear. And for that reason, this can be a tricky question. Beyond that, if you've been refused before, a common question that you should expect is, what has changed since your last interview? What the officer is really asking is, look, I see in my computer system that one of my colleagues determined that you were not qualified at that time for a visa. Why should I reach a different conclusion? And that's a really tricky question to answer because a lot of people will be defensive. They will think that they have to explain why they were refused previously. Well, unfortunately, you almost never know why you were refused because your visa officer never tells you why they're refusing you. So don't guess at the reasoning why you may have been denied. Don't try to explain that away. Answer that question by providing positive details. And this is where it gets really difficult. It's something we focus extensively on in our online guides. So I would recommend that you review that because it's an art more than a science. Let's see, we are at time. I'm going to try to take a couple of more questions because I know that there's a lot that I didn't get to. I'm going to go down to, let's see, a couple of questions about, I didn't provide social media accounts on my DS-160. I've talked about that a few times. I would urge you to submit a new one. So Ali says, the officer just asked about a sponsor, who's my uncle. This is fairly common. And let me try to explain something here. Some applicants are denied after an officer asks about just one aspect of their situation. So in this case, the officer asked about financial arrangements. And unfortunately, Ali, if you were denied, it may have been that you just weren't able to volunteer enough context and enough detail to demonstrate that you really have made financial arrangements and you've got enough money to pay for your education. If you were approved, it may be that you did such a good job of explaining your situation that the officer said, I don't need to waste any more time with this applicant. I'm satisfied. You're approved. Congratulations. And that's why, what I've mentioned earlier, the art of proactively volunteering your situation really is the key to a successful outcome. Jay Lee asks a really good question. Is it a disadvantage if my spouse is a US citizen? We met outside the US. We've been together for over 7 years. We're only going to the US to pursue my study. This is a red flag. It doesn't necessarily mean that you will be denied, but remember that a key criteria, a key requirement for a student visa is that you're going to leave the United States after you graduate. If you've got family in the United States, or you've got a pending green card application in your name, or in your case, you're married to a US citizen, all of that can tend to erode the conclusion that you're going to leave the United States. Because a visa officer may look at that situation and say, A, I'm not even convinced you're going to study, and B, I'm not convinced you're going to leave the United States because it looks like you're just trying to get into the country to reunite with your family or with your spouse. So this is where I would urge you to be very specific about explaining your situation outside of the country, your plans after you graduate, because you need to be very clear that your life path is not going to keep you in the United States. On the contrary, it's going to lead you out of the United States, but you've got to give a very specific and concrete explanation as to why. This is another issue that we deal with extensively in our online courses. So I would recommend that you take a look at that and reach out to us if you have any questions. So unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm really sorry I didn't get to all of your questions. I know that there's a lot here that I unfortunately didn't have time to get to. Please reach out to either Homebase or myself. I'll put my email address, general email address here again in the chat, which is info@zfvisa.com. You will all get an email after this session concludes with a link to the recording, and you can use that to reach out to Homebase and the team at Homebase if you have questions about that as well. Homebase is a tremendous source of guidance and support for you as you navigate through this process. But we are also here to help you out if you need, so don't hesitate to reach out. I do want to answer one last question. This was about financial deficits. Financial deficits are a potential deal breaker because you need to show you have enough money arranged. I thought the question was around quotas. And so let me just clarify, this is a common myth. I want to make it clear, there is no quota. There's no maximum number of student visas that can be approved. There's no minimum number of students or researchers that have to be rejected. Completely untrue. The only thing standing between you and a successful outcome is how you explain your qualifications. And I want to leave you with that note. Remind yourself that you qualify, you should qualify. As long as you are legitimately planning to go to the United States to study or conduct research, the only thing that you should be concerned about is establishing and demonstrating that you deserve that visa. So reach out to us if you have any questions. Visit zfvisaguides.com, review our expert guidance. I wish you all the best. I know that these are not simple times right now. Please hang with it. We want you to come to the United States. We value your presence on our college campuses and at our universities. So please keep it up. Thank you very much for joining us today. It was a pleasure. Cheers.